So this video is how to convert fractions into decimals into percents, and percents into decimals, and percents into fractions, and all of those conversions between fractions, decimals, and percents. Now I realize that some of you only need to watch parts of these videos, so they're labeled. You can fast forward through the parts that you already know how to do. So if you need help just with fractions to decimals, then only watch that part of the video. There's no need for you to watch the entire video. Yes, I know it's a longer than normal video. The reason is I wanted to get all 6 fraction decimal, fraction percent, percent decimal, etc. all in there in one video. So fast forward like you need to. Please, this skill is a prerequisite skill, so we need to make sure that you have 100% confidence with it and knowledge about it before we start going into repeating decimals into fractions. So the only part of fraction, decimal, percent conversions that is not in this video but will be in the next one is repeating decimals to fractions, because they can be a bit tricky. Let's start by turning fractions into decimals. A fraction, by definition, means a comparison between two numbers. So the fraction bar is just like a division bar. So 5/6 really is 5. It's 5 divided by 6. So you put the top number inside the division box. You put the bottom number outside the division box and you divide. Well, 6 doesn't go into 5, so you put a 0. And then a decimal point and another 0, so 6 goes into 58 times. You're left with 48. You bring down the 0, and 6 goes into 23 times, and 2 left over. And then once you have that 2 and you bring down the 0, you recognize that you're going to have another 3, and 6 times 3 is 18, and then that means that the 3 is going to repeat. So 5/6 is the same as 0.83 repeating. So we can't forget that repeating bar. Had this number gone on, you could have stopped after the thousandths place, because things like sevenths go on for a while before it starts repeating, and I don't want you to be dividing until the cows come home. You can just stop and round to the thousandths place. So that would have been like going one more spot and then saying, okay, if that's a 5, it would be 0.834 or 0.833 if it was a number less than 5. That's assuming it wasn't the 5/6 that you see here. 2 and 1/25. So I'm going to rewrite the big number because I know that 2 and 1/25 has to be equivalent to the decimal that I write, and the whole number is going to be the same. And then I'm going to put 25 and the 1. 25 does not go into 1, so I put a 0, a decimal point, and oops, 25 still doesn't go into 10, so I put another 0. I have to remember this 0. This 0 is the one 0 that the most of you decide not to put, because you're like, oh, I don't have to put that 0. You do. Now 25 into 100 is 4. So 1/25 is 0.04, so 2 and 1/25 is 2.04, or 2 and 400ths. So yeah, 2.83 repeating, 2.8 repeating is a decimal. How do I turn it into a percent? Well, in order to turn a number into a percent, I'm going to multiply it by 100 and put a percent sign. Well, the alternative to multiplying by 100 is to move the decimal point 2 spaces. So no matter what number you decide to multiply by 100, all you're really doing to that number is moving a decimal point 2 places to the right. So 2.8 repeating becomes 288.8 repeating percent. And I'm going to ask that you remember to put the line on top of the 8, or you can go ahead and make it into a fraction when we learn how to make repeating decimals into fractions, which is your next lesson. So here you have 0.43. You multiply 43 hundredths by 100, because that's how you turn a decimal into a percent. You multiply it by 100, and that means it would be 43%, because when I move it over 2 places, I end up getting to the end of the number. 1.625, I know right away, just like with my number 2 over here, if I see a whole number, I'm going to have a percentage greater than 1. So that's how I knew this is a 2. It would be somewhere in the 200%. This is a number 1, so it's going to be in the 100%. So I'm going to move the decimal point 2 places, and I get 162.5%. Fractions into percents. So we can go the fractions to decimal to percent route. 3/8, that's really the only way that we can go because the denominator of 8 doesn't go into 100. So in order to do that, I would have to multiply it by like 12.5, and then it would be some ugly number on the top. So I'm not going to do that. In order to turn that into a percent, I would have to go ahead and turn it into a decimal first. And then when I turned it into a decimal, I would have to make sure 7. I know it ends up being 0.375, but I will finish my division. So 0.375, that's it as a decimal. I move the decimal point over 2 places, and I get 37.5%. So in order to turn a fraction into a percent, sometimes I have to go the route of decimal. I have to turn it into a decimal first, and then I have to turn it into a percent. Other times, like 1 7/10, the denominator of the fraction ends up being 100. Ends up being a factor of 100. So I can rewrite 7/10 as an equivalent fraction where a denominator is 100 of 70/100ths. The good thing about fractions are, if you're able to convert it where there's a denominator of 100, percent means per 100. So in this case, 1 70/100ths would be 170%. The 1 has to do with the whole number, and the 70 has to do with the fact that it's a fraction over 100 per 100. Again, if there is a denominator that isn't a factor of 100, you can't go the route of creating a fraction and then going into a percent. And just know that you could rewrite the 1, put the 10 outside and the 7 inside, and go, hey, 10 into 70, that's 7. 1.7, there's my decimal, move it over to 170%. So you always have the choice of making that fraction or mixed number into a decimal and then creating a percent out of it. Or, if the denominator is a factor of 100, you can convert equivalent into equivalent fractions and then rewrite it as a percent. Into decimal. Okay, so if turning a decimal into percent is multiplying by 100, then turning a percent into a decimal is going to be dividing by 100. So I'm going to replace the percent sign with a decimal point, and then I'm going to move it 2 places to the left and rewrite my number with the decimal point 1.02 or 1 200ths. I'm going to drop the percent sign, move the decimal point that I replace the percent sign with 2 places to the left, 0.53, 2.4. Oh, there's already a decimal point. Cool, I'm going to use that one. Move it 2 places to the left. Where there's an empty loop, I put a 0, and I end up with 0.024 or 24 thousandths. So if there's already an existing decimal point, use that decimal point to then move 2 places to the left. When there's not an existing decimal point, you're going to go ahead and create a decimal point where the percent sign was. Move it 2 places to the left. Decimal into fraction. Okay, so decimal into fraction. I'm going to say it 36 hundredths. I'm going to write it 36 hundredths. And I'm going to simplify it. Ooh, that can be reduced by 2, and then 2 again. If you were smarter than me, you would have reduced it by 4 originally, and you would get 9/25. 4 thousandths, 4 over 1,000. Reduce it, 1/250. 2 and 6/10, 2 and 6/10. I said it, I wrote it, and now I'm going to simplify it. I'm going back to this slide, so now you can see how to take a percent and make it into a fraction. 102%. 102 per over 100. Reduce it. 1 and 2/100. Simplify it. 1 and 1/50. 53%. 53 over 100. 2.4%. 2.4 over 100. Ew, that's awfully ugly. I'm going to make it into an equivalent fraction that's simplified. 24 over 1,000. No decimal points allowed. And reduce it. 12 over 500. Reduce it more. 6 over 250. Holy cow, I can reduce that for a long time. 3 over 125.